Welcome to Racing Roots with Hamm.
If you don't know our host, David Hamm, he's a 25-year NASCAR veteran, engine builder, and jackman.
Live every Monday evening, we have a new guest
From the racing world with their stories, their paths,
their racing roots.
Our host, David Hamm.
And good evening, everyone. Welcome to Racing Roots with Hamm. Mr. Bill Blair, I'm just so excited to have you here. It's ridiculous. I've been excited all week thinking about it.
Well, thank you.
Yes, sir. Always great to see you. I saw you last down at Daytona, Ponce Inlet.
Yeah, racing North Turn.
Yeah, Racing's North Turn.
It's a good deal.
That's a lot of history. You just walk into that area, and I feel like I would say stepping back in time, but, you know, it's a little bit modernized compared to what it was back then, I'm sure.
Well, with me, David, it brings back memories. Mm-hmm. And I can still visualize and see the guys and the cars and the people and make chill bumps run up and down my arms, you know. And I just, you know, I love that period of time. And I know you've heard this 1,000 times. That was when racing was racing. Mm-hmm. But things change. We move on. They made 38,039 Fords. And my daddy probably tore up 24 of them. And no telling how many the rest of them were torn up. You know, we run generally 4 or 5 times a week back in those days. And I remember Bill France would run, when he formed NASCAR in 48, started running 2 nights on different locations. Might be some in Georgia, might be some in the Carolinas. They were just tearing the cars up. And France he and his wife, they used to come by our place, which is an old farm, 800-acre dairy farm, Blair Farm, and called Clover Hill Farms. But they'd sit around the big oak tree and talk. And boys, what we're going to do. And it's getting hard to find a 39 Ford. Everybody wanted a 39 Ford because Raymond Parks, that's what he bought for Red Barn, Fonny Flock, Roy Hall, and Lois C. So it might be monkey see, monkey do. But the 39s also made good liquor cars. The first one to have hydraulic brakes on you. And see, 38s didn't have it, and prior 38s didn't have hydraulic and mechanical. Mm-hmm. You could push for a week and you still run over something, you know.
Did he have a big trunk?
Well, sort of. But you see the little coots, you take all the back out of them, and it just opened up into a pretty good-sized space. You get 125 gallons on pretty easy. But anyway, they was tearing some of those cars up. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? I know there's a guy named Billy Davis who used to keep his eye out all the time looking for 39 Fords for my daddy. I think that led to the Strictly Stock stuff. Because Bill France did, as I understand, he told my daddy, and they sat around a big oak over there and talked about this, and that he'd asked Ford Motor Company to consider remaking 39 Fords so they have something to race with. And Ford reluctantly told him appreciate it, but we just wouldn't look good on our behalf to do that. We're in a business to make new cars, but we appreciate you asking. Huh. So that never materialized, so hence Strictly Stock. And they ran a test on that deal down in Florida, probably Jacksonville or somewhere in that area, I believe it was, for a few laps. They had a modified race schedule, but they figured they'd just get a few of the newer cars out there and let them run a few laps, see what people thought about it. And so the crowd liked it. Next thing you know, he scheduled a Strictly Stock race in Charlotte, that new Charlotte Speedway, built by 2 Moonshiners from Kernersville, North Carolina. And they got caught with their liquor, and so they lost their lease on that land to the property owner, and then he, you know, contacted Bill France and promoted races there. See, moonshine started a lot of this stuff back in the day, and it was a big part of racing was moonshining too. Well, anyway, in the Charlotte Observer, some years ago, I was over there and looking at in the library, looking at the papers, and it says that Bill France had run an experiment. And most of the paper was devoted for what Bruton Smith was going to do at Concord, you know. And it was an experiment. And a little bit about that deal, as I remember, seeing 49, I'd have been 11 years old. Yeah. I remember a little of it. But see, France, when he come to promote it, Greensboro Fairgrounds and Peace Haven and Fairgrounds in Weston, he'd come stay with us some and finally got a place on Lee Street in Greensboro. And they moved up there finally, and of course still had the place in Daytona Beach. But see, France moved on up from Florida, started promoting on up what I'd call 95 and Interstate 85. Yeah. On up to Richmond finally. And he was co-promoting that some with Sam Nunes. Sam was with AAA. Well, my daddy built the track in 47, but my daddy sanctioned with him. But the race at the fairgrounds over there, getting back to that, they sat around the tree and talk about it and what they're going to do. So he scheduled that race over there June the 19th, I believe it was, and in 1949. And telephone rang one day during the week there, and it was Annie France, and she talked to my daddy, and I heard him talking to her, and a little bit. Apparently, Bill France got on the phone. But what the conversation was about, she called him and said, "Are you coming to Charlotte this weekend?" My dad said, "Well, I don't have I'm gonna be there." I said, "High Point's gonna be there, but I don't have anything to drive. I still got my modified." And she said, "Well, that's what he wants to talk to you about." And you say that the gonna be a big crowd? He said, "Yeah." Now, the reason he knew there's going to be a big crowd, High Point was about 5,000 people at that time, 5, 6, something like that. Mm-hmm. And he had a liquor business, and he sold half High Point liquor, moonshine.
Yeah.
And so he knew about it. And plus the farm. I mean, we delivered milk all over town.
Yeah.
And the Blair boys, there was 7 of them, and they were everywhere. And they was in the land business and farming and everything else.
Yeah.
So she said, well, the goods said, Bill, meaning Big Bill, he's just worried to death. There's nobody going to be there, not going to have enough cars. Of course, people still calling and coming in about it. So how about tell him what you just told me? So she put him on the phone, and Big Bill asked my daddy again, said, are you going to be in Charlotte? And he said, yeah, I'm going to be there. Well, you don't have anything to drive, do you? He said, no. And he said, well, that's one reason I call you. There's 2 guys here from Great Bend, Kansas. They own a Lincoln Mercury dealer. And they brought 2 Lincolns. They brought their own driver with them, and they asked me about getting somebody to drive the other car. And I thought about you. And Bill said, well, yeah, I'd like to drive it. And he said, well, they taken them out on Wilson Boulevard, and they gave them Jim Roper. That was their driver, the fastest car, and you could drive the other one. Now, my daddy never qualified that car, so he started toward the rear. And I don't know, it had 18, 19, 20 cars, something like that. And Bob Flock led the first 5 laps of that race. The next 145 was led by Bill Blair and the other Lincoln. He done call them and passed everybody. In the meantime, it was a hot day, and a lot of cars were running hot. Coming in pits, pouring water around them, and going back out. And the track started out being dirt, and they had it well watered down, with calcium chloride, and as they put on.
Well, let me ask you a question right quick.
Sure.
Before you get back to that, was that the speedway that was on Little Rock Road and Wilkinson Boulevard, the corner there in Charlotte? Okay, because I grew up in that area. I lived out beside off of Morris Chapel Road, and I worked on Little Rock Road, and then I moved out beside the airport right near Hamm and Moody for, I don't know, 1980 or something. Right. So I always passed by there, and I heard that there was a speedway there at some point. And there was like a Allison's Trucking or something.
Right. Exactly. It was 3/4 mile dirt, and it was, it was, for that period of time, it was a fairly decent track. All of them were dirt. Maybe seat anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000. I think Hillsborough would seat about 10. No, they wouldn't seat that much. Probably 5 or 6. The High Point Speedway I know would seat 10, but they were all similar. Except the High Point Speedway had a tunnel under it to get in and out of it, and there's a tunnel for the pedestrians to get out of the grandstand back into the infield for the fans. But get back to that Charlotte race. There's not a lot of people know what happened over there that day, and in fact, there's not a lot of people left living that witnessed that race. And there was very little written about it. The main deal that happened was that my daddy fell out, then he made a pit stop, and according to the paper and others that were living at that point in time, he done lapped the field at least twice with that Lincoln. The guy told him, and they said, how do you want me to drive this car? It's brand new. The guy told him, said, drive the hell out of it. So that's what my daddy did. And I know there's an article in Benny Phillips wrote it with Jim Paschal, who had driven his daddy's car over there that day, and driven his daddy's car. It was a 47 Ford, I believe it was, coupe. Lee Petty was there with somebody else's Buick, and he turned it upside down. And when it stopped, it landed upside down. I think the wheels were still turning on it. But anyway, he was there. They tore a few cars. But it was an errant pit stop that put the Lincoln that my daddy drove out of the race. He come in to get gas, and they had a gas can there, and they didn't have phones or nothing that period of time. They just took the lid off the tank and turned it upside down,
Yeah.
And then the guy went around and put a coat of oil in it, and the hoods, half split hoods, you open one side up, you take the oil cap off, put a coat of oil in it, and some bystander wanted to help, so he he reached over, he took his shirt off, T-shirt, and took the radiator cap off, and picked up a water bucket. And, of course, when he took that radiator cap up, the water rushed out of it, and then they poured cool water back in, and it broke the thermostat housing on it, and that put him out of the race. And you're talking about a fight. After that, my daddy got a hold of that guy, and my mother said he tried to kill him.
Oh, yeah.
You know? But anyway, that's sort of a deal what happened. And then when Hubert Westmoreland, he was originally from Kernersville. He moved to Burlington, and he was a moonshine guy himself. And he fixed a lot of moonshine cars. And Hubert was an easygoing guy and didn't say too much, very low-key and real quiet voice. But he knew what he was doing. And he entered that car, which was a liquor car, meaning that it had a helper spring on the rear of it. See, in that period of time, they run the liquor cars, too. I got pictures of my daddy's liquor car, and they sat sort of like this with no load on them. Then they sat down. And then the helper spring had 2 clamps on one on each end, and it would catch them, and that supported the load. But anyway, Hubert had that car entering the race. He happened to see Glenn Dunaway walk by, and Hubert just getting up out from under the car. And he asked Glenn, said, "Glenn, said, you driving anything?" Glenn said, "No, I'm just over here to watch the race." Like many of the others, all they had was their modifieds that they drove. So Hubert said, "How about driving this car?" And Glenn said, "Okay." So when my daddy fell out with Glenn, he took over the lead of that race. And then he won it, and the other Lincoln finished second, and it was running hot at the end of that race. So he wasn't running about 40, 50 mile an hour when he finished the race. That was with Jim Roper. And they're all from Great Bend, Kansas. Now, after the race is over, I sort of believe, now this is my opinion, that France really wanted one of them Lincolns to win. The guy that in the newspapers that did Dick Tracy, he's the one that made a mention about it in the newspaper, and that's how those 2 guys from Kansas found out about the race back here.
Okay.
I didn't know his name, but the driver of the Lincoln, they brought Roper here with them, and he got the fastest one. The other one, my daddy drove, and it was number 44, or 34, which way. But anyway, Roper, he was, I won't say a braggart, but he was proud of himself, thought a lot of himself. And a lot of the guys down here just didn't warm up to him. Yeah. And then one of the other guys that had the Lincoln there was Millard Clothier and Ben McIntyre. I think McIntyre owned the dealership, and Clothier was the money man. And, I mean, they let everybody know that they were well off.
Plus, he was I guess you could say a Yankee. I mean.
Yeah, they were Great Bend, Kansas.
Yeah.
And they didn't, people didn't warm up to them, so it didn't last for just a few races here. They run Daytona Beach. My daddy drove the Lincoln again there and led it. And run out of gas, and they poured gas in it. See, that track down there, David, you couldn't run the whole 160 mile without running out of gas. You had to stop there at the end of the race and get gas. So they were getting smarter as they went, short shift and stuff like that. And I'll tell you about that later. But getting back to the race over here, the most interesting thing about that race, they disqualified Hubert's car because of the helper springs. Somebody noticed them. Now, they were inspected, pre-race inspection, and nobody said a thing about it. Post-race is when the complaint started about that. Yeah. So France disqualified him, said it's supposed to be strictly stock. So Hubert got a lawyer and took him to court, and it's tried in Greensboro. And they presented their case, in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the judge made the decision that, you can read here, it says strictly stock in entry blank. And see, the rules back then were generally on the entry blank, maybe a paragraph. They didn't have rule books. Okay. Eventually they did, and they add to them a little bit. But France made his rules as he went many times. And I think on the last page of that rule book, it said that they reserved to change, to be the last word. In other words, he could change the rule anytime he wanted to, and he did so. Yeah.
So they got taken to court. I guess those people never raced again in NASCAR.
No. What they did, the judge ruled in France's favor. Okay. And the drivers had at that Sunday, June the 19th, that they made up a pot and gave the money winnings to Glenn Dunaway. They felt strongly about that he drove all day and didn't win the race and got disqualified, so they passed a hat and gave him some money. And then went to court, and France won. Now, the end of that deal was when they give it to Jim Roper. I don't know if maybe he run one more race. I don't remember him lasting maybe 1 or 2 races, and that was it. And same thing about the 2 guys that brought the Lincolns here. But later on, if you remember, I don't guess you would remember this, but they had the race at Darlington, 1950s, first super speedway track built down here.
Yeah, it was about 21 years before.
Of course, yeah, you wouldn't remember. But the guy that won that race was Johnny Mance. And guess whose car it was? Here at Westmoreland. And the car belonged to, guess who? Bill France, Alvin Hawkins. And I always felt like, my dad did too, that to make up to Hubert for what happened, that France got him to prepare that Plymouth. Yeah. That's the way I feel about it. Now, there's a story behind that too. Cotton Owens had a Plymouth. Now, Plymouth offered an export-import kit, meaning that the export kit had a bigger carburetor off a truck and exhaust and intake mounted those 6 cylinders all one piece. You know, they could come apart to all one piece with the carburetor on it. You could take it off as assembly and put it back on as assembly. And I don't know if it had a different cam in it or not, but it had a different intake and carburetor.
What year would that have been?
1950.
Okay.
6-cylinder Plymouth. This plain Jane, probably $1,500 car, 15, 18 or something like that. And by the way, the 39 Fords was only about $700 new. Yeah. So
you saw some in a picture when you come in, right?
There's one to put in that picture.
Like,
sure.
Wish we still had that.
Yeah.
Here the Statesville.
The deal was at Darlington, Harold Brazenton. Harold been to Indianapolis, and he come back south to his home down there wanting to build him a track, which, you know, I won't go into that, but they ended up building an egg-shaped track, you know. And so he was getting it sanctioned by a Midwestern organization, and he made a trip up to High Point, and he came by my daddy's service station to put up a poster about it and talk to my daddy about coming down and run. My daddy, as others had told Harold, said, you need to talk to Bill France. You're not going to have enough cars if you don't, because we're not going to come run for you. See, France did not want them running for somebody else, because he had. If you run his circuits, you got points for every race, and to do that, that was his deal with the point system. Gets you to attend all the races. Then he could tell the promoter that all the cars will be there and name drivers and have a full field of cars. They pay a bigger purse. Everybody would benefit. Well, when it came to Darlington, Harold was not going to sanction with Bill France to start with. And then the guys kept telling you need to talk to Bill France, so he got France involved, and that's how France got involved with Darlington. And there was some publicity shots made of him looking at the blueprints of Darlington and so forth. And my daddy was there, and I was there when they done that. They made a picture of my daddy standing next to his son-in-law's Mercury, new Mercury, and they used that in some of the magazines and stuff. And I got pictures of it today. But that Plymouth that Hubert had that showed up, it did not have that export-import kit on it. Now, when I say export-import, I'm not sure the proper name for it, but I called it that all these years, and that's the way I heard it, but it was like an import kit. Well,
just easier to bolt on stuff when it gets over there, basically.
Yeah, and it made more power. Okay. See, the carburetor's bigger jets, and bigger free-flowing intake and exhaust manifold. Yeah. Well, anyway, Cotton Owens had one, and they wouldn't let him run it. So he had to take it off and put the stock one back on there, you know. Well, that time you go down the street there, and they inspect them at an old shed about 2 or 3 miles from the track, and they escort you back to the track with one of the officials, so you didn't tamper with it. And they put a seal on it, and then clamped it together as a lead seal, and it then printed on it. It had the wire run through it. Yeah. Well, Hubert, so he took his back to Burlington. You could take a car home. You could drive it home if you want to. That's what a lot of them did. As long as you didn't mess with that seal. And the seal was around the cylinder head bolt, carburetor, and all. They had drilled holes in them so that you couldn't take it loose.
It's funny how you say that, because we started doing that again with the Cup engines a few years ago when we had to have a sealed engines and that type of thing. They started drilling the ends of the studs, and then you had the seal, which I know we've always done that for years with the lead. but then they have these new white ones that you push it in, but you can't pull it back out. And
That's
I know that
right.
we've already done that, but now they're doing it with the cylinder heads and all that. But they did it back in 1952.
Well, they need to dig old Hubert up and get him to tell him how he would beat that seal. He could do it.
Yeah.
Well, he went home and put his export-import manifolds on it and carburetor on it.
Yeah.
And won the race. And they wouldn't let Cotton do it. Cotton didn't know about what Hubert done. Well, anyway, he won the race, inspected, and nothing said about it. My daddy drove that same Plymouth. His first NASCAR, what we call Cup today, under the lights, was at Columbia, South Carolina. And my daddy finished second in it, and Frank Money and Perry Smith's Studebaker won it. Come time to inspect the cars, Hubert was pulling that car with a 49 torpedo back Oldsmobile, green one, dark green. And his wife Lottie was there with him, and my mother and myself, and I was with him. I went down with Dad. Well, when the race is over, Hubert raised the trunk. There's a green Army blanket laying there. He got that intake and carburetor and manifold as assembly off that car and walked around late in that trunk and took this side of the Army blanket, flipped it over it, and under it was the original stock one. He took it and set out on the ground. Huh. After a while, the inspector come to it and looked at it. That's right. That's okay. You know, they made something like a valve to go down through the ventures of the carburetor,
sure.
and he can make all that stuff.
Yeah, go no go.
And so that car was illegal as John Dillinger, but it belonged to Bill France and Alvin Hawkins.
Yeah.
But that was a little bit of what they did, and they could get by those seals. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
They could do that.
That's wild. I mean, I'm sure there's ways to do it. They probably just melt their own lead, you think?
I'm not sure what they done.
Probably had a number imprinted on it, though, like NASCAR number.
Well, they might have
Who knows?
used the wax to put on it and make another mold where they could reclamp.
Yeah.
Is what I would have probably done.
Yeah. Yeah. See, there's a way around it.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways to do it.
Hey, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. We got Bill Blair in with us, so he's going to talk some more about NASCAR history. And if you have any questions, you can put your questions on. Tracy will be monitoring those, and Bryson as well on the YouTubes and
with
on
a big Q.
Yes. So we'll be right back to Racing Roots with Hamm.
Hi folks, this is Bill Blair. I guess you know where I'm going. Mount Airy, North Carolina, September the 10th. Moonshine Racers Reunion, 3rd annual. The autograph session will start at 10 a.m. that morning, and once you get your driver's autograph, be sure to go over to the silent auction tables and look at the items on sale and make a bid on them. It goes for a good cause. And then also the event t-shirts, they'll be there in that same corner, and they're beautiful shirts. I've seen them, and I'll be wearing one. And just walk up down the street and look at all the race cars. Last year we had 85. I think we'll have a lot more this year. If you've got old race cars, you want to bring yours, bring them on up. Get there about 8 o'clock that morning. The event starts promptly at 10 a.m. And just sit back and enjoy yourself. Talk to everybody up there. They want to talk about racing, naturally, and early day moonshine. That's how racing started, you know, the moonshiners and the racers. Also, folks, another thing that of interest would be the moonshiners. They'll be there. There'll be some from Kentucky, but mainly here in North Carolina. They'll have a still set up and running to show you how the shine was made. Well, the police wouldn't really let us make liquor, you know, so we're going to run some hot water. We'll show you how it was made. Right after lunch, about 1 p.m., we're going to start with the Wall of Fame induction, honoring our early day stock car racers and people who made a contribution to stock car racing. Then later on that day, at about probably 3, we'll be headed out to the track with a parade to visit the old racetrack. And then when we get back, then about 5 p.m., the Sons of the Bootleg will be there to entertain you at the big tent until 8 o'clock. Remember, folks, with all that's going on up there in Mount Airy September 10th, it's all free to the public. If you've been to Mount Airy, you know what a great place that is. It's a friendly town, friendly atmosphere, a lot of places to eat. So if you've never been there, come and check us out. For more information, go to www.visitmayberry.com.
Dust in the sky with an old dirt track and an engine that whines. Yeah, this old dirt track, it gets down in your blood. Stay in the groove, son. Find the right one. Just stay out of my way.
And we're back to Racing Roots with Hamm right here, 550 AM, 92.9 FM, and on DHAM I Am on YouTube. If you want to see us live here in the Randy Marion studio, you can also go to Racing Roots with Hamm on Facebook and see our Facebook Live. So we're getting some props set up now. We got Bill Blair in the studio with us, and it's great to see him again. Last time I saw him was down at the Ponce Inlet. We had the historic North Turn Legends Parade.
Right.
And it was the beach road course. It wasn't exactly the original because I guess the road's been moved over, a part of the road.
Well, the beach is all original except new sand. But the old road, there's a section of it left.
Yeah.
But the rest has to be, it's put a few curves in it.
Yeah.
The original deal was the old highway about this wide. With one, as they passed one another, you could probably reach out and touch the car. That's how close they were. And, of course, they had some wrecks back on that backstretch. The guy got killed a time or two.
Oh.
But, this short section of it's left there. But basically, it's still a historic spot for us to go down there.
Yeah.
To Ormond Beach, they used to spend the winters there, the manufacturers did. And they would send the car down by rail. That's where the railroad stopped, I believe it was right there at that time. And that big hotel. And the mechanics would come and work on the cars, keep them running. And they'd challenge one another up down that beach. They'd set up a barrel or something to race to and race around it and race back. And that's how that deal got started. And later on, as you know, every year it kept getting faster and faster, more vehicles. Then they had the speed runs and people were building special vehicles for to set land records, you know. And that was probably recognized as a place to be, that Long Beach. And it seemed to me like it used to be wider than it is now. It might be my imagination, but it seemed like it was. But when the Northerns come in and left, they left the beach packed. Then they'd ring the big fire bells at all the firehouses, and they'd let schools out, and people just crowd up and down, get on them sand dunes to watch the speed runs. And I'm speaking later in the well, it was in the 30s basically.
Probably global warming has caused the
I guess. But
icebergs are melting.
There's some got hurt there very bad. One drowned, and one spectator's got killed one time. A photographer got killed. You didn't know which way they was going, and they'd shred the tires. The tires was made of silk. They brought the tires with them. Big old tall tires, you know. I'm gonna call them tars. That's what us racers call a tire. Is a tar.
Tars. That's it. Yes.
But
it was amazing how close the spectators were.
Yeah, and see that Ormond Beach where it started, and as people built their homes on the beach, then they started moving on down towards Ponce down there. And I think that beach, as I remember, I've been to two different ones, and I think they built 4 until the last one was built because of intrusion. And when we used to run there at Daytona at the last in the 50s, there was houses there on the beach at that time. And Bill France had to do something and find a place somewhere else to run or move it. But on that first year of him having an experiment at Charlotte, his next race he had was at Daytona Beach. It had about 4,000 people. Now, over at Charlotte, they call it New Charlotte Speedway, but it's anything but new. Dirt, you know, rough as a cob. They had, depending on where you got your information from, but in the newspaper it says something like 12,000 people or so. That was probably a tax deal there. But it's really close to what I understand, about 18,000, 19,000 people. I know that he told T. Taylor Warren. T. Taylor was a guy from up around Delaware, up north somewhere, and he brought his wife Jenny down to Greensboro, North Carolina, the Greensboro High Point Road, and he went to work for Allman Studios. A friend of my daddy's there in High Point. It was a furniture studio is what it was. They made pictures for the furniture manufacturers, put in the magazines. And Taylor met my daddy through them and started going to races with my daddy. And my daddy introduced him to Bill France. And Jack Cancer was the original first NASCAR photographer. And Taylor wanted a job with France because he loved stock car racing. He had ventured up to, when he was lived up north, he had went to different races up there, you know, just loved it to death. And France told him, said, well, I've already got a photographer. But if you willing, said there's some races that he can't go to, maybe we can use you. And Taylor agreed to it. Now, see, Taylor had a full-time job working at the studio. and he hung out down at the service station with my dad in his race cars. So that's how he got started, and that was at North Wilkesboro. So when this come along in 1949, Taylor was already working his way into being a full-time photographer, and I'll tell you how he done that. But France over at Charlotte, he was worried to death not going to have a crowd. Didn't know how this deal was going to work, Strictly Stock racing, how it's going to work. And they called it Strictly Stock. That's what everybody else called it, too. Russ Catlin, Quincyberry, and different ones. And when they patrol come up over there and told him, said, you're going to have to close the gates and start this race because it's blocking the highways. People can't get to and from. Well, he told Taylor, France told Taylor once, said, Taylor, make me a picture of all them people coming across the track. So when you come into that track, you come across the back straightaways.
Okay.
Unless you went around and going to sit in the grandstand, then you went on around and parked over in the field. But to get in the infield, you had to come across the track into the infield. Mm-hmm. And they just swarms of them coming. And said, make me a picture of that. He said, I want that picture to be, I'm going to use it and put it at my headboard, over my headboard. That's going to be the first thing I see when I get up in the morning and the last thing I see when I go to bed at night. So Taylor made in that picture, and I always wondered what happened to that picture. It's somewhere, no doubt. I bet they can still got it. But, excuse me, that was their first race, second race at Daytona. They had reported 4,000 people there. But remember, he finally had to put signs up down there, rattlesnakes. Because, see, people's coming by boats into the Inland Harbor there and coming across and getting them sand dunes and come across into the track. And nobody could stop it. No crowd control. Yeah. Because when I went down there and I stood along the edge of that highway, the back stretch, my dad told me, he said, you stay right over here. Don't you go anywhere else. So I went with everybody else after they left from a standstill going up the beach, to watch them come down the back stretch. And I stand right on the edge, and they come over a knoll so fast I didn't have time to stand back. It blowed me off my feet, and I landed on my butt in the sand at the sand dunes. And so I didn't do that again. But anyway, that was the second race. Third race, Okanichi. And he put everything he could into it to advertise for that race. That was going to be the make-or-break race. And he ended up having a good crowd of 19,000 people. Madrid drove that Lincoln again down there, and I don't know where it finished, but I believe that, if I ain't mistaken, it seemed like it ran off the track with that thing. But anyway, he told my dad, he said, sell that modified. This is the future. This is the future of what we're going to do. He run 8 races, and I think they had 90-some thousand people all total that they reported, and that'd been over 12,000 per race. And now we got, it changed to Grand National. Now we got Cup race, and that's where she started right there.
I saw a cool picture of you and Will. I guess it must have been at the thing in Mount Airy.
Yeah, I met him. I don't exactly when I first met him, but we had something in common. Ronnie Thomas was coming along, with his dad to all the races, and Ronnie just a kid, and they started that Baby Grand Circuit. Got first started by Bill Ellis, and there was an ATU agent sort of took it away from Ellis, and then France took it away from the ATU agent and called it the Daytona-race series. Okay. That was Tony Chapman, the ATU agent. You don't generally get over on Bill Ellis, but he did. Well, Will built Ronnie Thomas a Vega. Beautiful, beautiful car. And I believe Will told me that was the first turnkey car that he ever built. And, of course, I had built the motor for the boys that worked for me in there in the shop. We built it. And I think the first race was at Atlanta. And I think Will can correct you on this, but I believe it sat on the pole and led the race, and Byron come out of it. If you knew Ronnie and Jay, they would just spend so much money. And they didn't have a lot of money to spend, but we needed a big oil pan on it. And the used stock oil pan, that wasn't enough. So it didn't last the full race. I believe that's what happened to that car. Mm-hmm. But we come back later, put the right oil pan back on, and no more problems with it. And that's where Ronnie got started. And that's where Will got started with Ronnie.
Okay, yeah. Will's been around quite a while in the sport. Moved down and started his own business there in Fort Mill.
He sure did.
Yeah. In engineering. He come down as an engineer.
Very, very smart guy. I enjoy being around him. You always learn something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, the France pretty smart dude. He used that, and my dad did too. My dad learned a lot from Bill France. He always said that France was a better promoter than he was a driver.
Yeah.
And well, my daddy met him, and I got to meet him also. But I was 3 years old. I didn't know what's going on, but was at High Point Speedway in 1940.
So you're not wanted by the law or anything, right? Because that's major. Just Bill Hamby's tuned in. Our old sheriff's office.
Not that I know of.
I got you. Yes.
But see, they built that track right across the street from our dairy farm.
Yes.
In France, Lloyd C., Red Vault, Roy Hall, Bill Snowden, Bonnie Flock, Uncle Joe Blair, just on and on. People come from all over the country to race there. And France was driving a Graham, number 1, and he turned it over and just tore it all to pieces. And Lloyd won the race. And my daddy, I believe, finished third in that car. It was a 39 Ford with shoe polish on it, number 20. I believe it was just number 2 on that particular. He's always been number 2, by the way.
Yeah.
But that's where we met Bill France and those guys. And as I grew up, I can remember that. The main thing I remember is the fact that it was such a big place, and the noise and the dust.
And because you were really young.
Yeah.
So, yes.
And my mother carried me over there. We just had to walk across the street, which would have been probably a half-mile total walk, you know. Mm-hmm. But, I still, and that place stayed there for years. And when the war came, that's what shut it down. The war came. Mm. And those guys, the Beatty brothers, they were playboys from Jacksonville, North Carolina, and they'd been in Annapolis, much like Harold Brazelton had. And they come back, wanted to build a track, and that was a big old apple orchard owned by the state of North Carolina. And so they bought it from the state and didn't tell nobody what they were doing. So the surveyors showed up and started surveying that place, and they come across the street about lunchtime and get milk from the dairy over there. They loved that chocolate milk, and you get milk at that time with cream on top of it. Mm-hmm. And they didn't tell them what they was doing. So my daddy went over there one day and saw what they were doing, the way they shaped it out. See, it was going to be a racetrack. He knew what a racetrack was. And so that would have been in probably 38 when they bought that property. It didn't take them long to build it back then. And so he was the first to get to go around that track. And they had a challenge race between him and Jimmy Llewellyn. Jimmy had a new Ford also. So they got over there, Pete English, one of the owners of the English Motor Company there in High Point, Ford dealer. Him and Jimmy were pretty good buddies, and so he got in the infield and held the handkerchiefs up, white handkerchief, and he dropped it. They were going to take off. One was on one straightaway and the other was on the other straightaway. So whoever caught the other one first was considered the winner, but don't pass it, don't throw rocks on the front of the car and all, So anyway, Pete dropped the flag and they took off. My daddy caught Jim in a few minutes and a few laps and went ahead and passed him anyway. Mm-hmm. And so that was the first official race up there at that track was between them two. But, that's how that deal started. Then the war shut it down, and the Blair boys, Beatty boys come to see them and said, how about buying this property in the racetrack? And after the war's over, we'll lease it back from you, and you'll make money on it. And if not, you'll have it to add to your farm, use as pasture. And it was 137 acres, I believe it was, something like that is what it was all total. It held 10,000 people in the grandstand, humongous grandstand. I got some of the pillars out of it now, the big old 2x2 cement pillars that you put the post on. Yeah. And so I got that and some of the posts out of that track. Took about a day and a half to dig them up. Mm. I got the original post.
Yeah. What you gonna do with those?
I got in the shop there at the house.
That's cool to have. Yeah. Gosh.
But anyway, that the boys voted 4-3 not to buy it. That's how close that they come to buying that thing. But it was sold at auction on a rainy day for about $10,000. Dealers Hedgecott bought it and tore it down and sold the lumber to build a church with there in High Point, and ended up having the land. And Blair still used it because Dealers was a good friend of ours. And in fact, Blair's put him in business, in the land business to start with, and then later on, Hitchcock Lumber Company. Mm-hmm. So after that deal, my daddy went to the war in Baltimore, Maryland, building battleships. And when he come home, he and his brother built their own racetrack right next to the old High Point Speedway. And it was a half-mile dirt track called Tri-City. And that's where I really got to know those guys. I was old enough then to know what's going on. Bill France come down and sanction with him, and the Flock boys come down. And by the way, Bob drove one of my daddy's cars at the High Point Speedway and just tore it all to hell. And so this is a good story here. It was 39 Ford. My daddy he had 2 or 3 at one time. And the reason being, they were different colors. Blue with black fenders and solid black. And then later on, he had a dark brown with just different colors. And the reason you do that, if you make too many trips with the same car into Martinsville, they're going to know what you're doing. Oh. So he would run one this color this week, and then the next week another one, another color. And some of the Moonshiners were known to repaint them. There's a guy, and you'll meet him in Mount Airy. If you come up there this year, Revis Brim, he constantly painted a 1954, just sometime twice a week, sometime twice a month. Just keep the law, away from him. Yeah. Because you see the same one all the time, something's up. Mm-hmm. Well, Bob tore that car up bad. Bob Flock did. And so they beat it out with a ball peen hammer and took it to Langhorne, Pennsylvania. And this would have been 1940, 41. And Lois C's up in Langhorne. Bill France is there. Raymond Parks is there. Roy Hall, all the big boys, there. Mm-hmm. Well, Dad shows up with that old beat-up 39 Ford, and they laughed at him, the Yankees did. And so you might well have left that thing at home. It looks like it needed to be in the junkyard, making remarks about So there was a guy named Monk Payne there, and Monk was my daddy's best friend because he had more tools than the rest of them had. And so Monk said, well, you boys won't be laughing after the race. Yeah. Well, how much money you want to bet on that thing? Monk said, how much you got? So they got him up a bet. Well, Lloyd won the race, but right there behind Lois C was that old beat-up number 2 car, Bill Blair's. Mm. And them Yankees come up and paid him right there and just said, man, I would never believe this.
All right, we're back to Racing Roots with Hamm, and we've got Bill Blair in with us this evening. And Bill Blair went to his first race, I guess it was 1940 when you were 3 years old, something like that?
Yeah, 1940, yeah.
Roughly.
3 years old, yeah.
Yeah. So, Bryson, if you would move, let's see, can you get both of these cameras? Can you get the picture in?
Well, if you need to hold it right there for just a minute.
Yep, there you go. So that is a picture of.
Okay, and I'm gonna tell you what it is. If you can you see it good enough? Do you got any idea what that's what's
good.
Happening?
Yeah.
Okay, what you're looking at is a 1939 Ford called the baby diaper car. The reason they called it the baby diaper car is because what color do we paint it? Well, the guy owned the baby diaper service there in High Point painted his trucks pink and green. He said, well, I got some paint y'all can have. So he went and got it, brought it to us here. Yeah. So we painted it pink and green. And they painted it with a brush.
Pink and green. So.
Well, now put it back up there, son. Oh, okay. Now, you're not done yet. Now, what the deal is there, that car, if you look, there's a chain tied to the tree that's tied to the rear axle housing of that car. At the rear of that car, you notice there's a guy there with a big oil can like you oil the freight train, the hopper. It's on the freight train. It's a big old oil can. I still got that can. Mm-hmm. And on that is rims with no tires on them, and they're sitting down on wooden platforms. It's wood left over from the farm that my daddy built and set that car down on it. And in the trunk of that car, of course, is the cylinder heads and different stuff where they put in the trunk to add weight to it. The guy there with that oil can is Wes Hitchcock. Jay Hitchcock is his son, builds Hitchcock chassis. You might have heard of him there in High Point.
Yeah, I have.
And then the guy there behind the steering wheel is Bub Hitchcock. That's Wes's brother. And the guy there underneath the hood with a long hammer and a screwdriver, and a hammer, is Bill Blair. And that little guy there with his hands over his ears is me. And then there to my right is the little red wagon. That's my race car.
Oh, okay.
Now, that big old oak tree there stayed there until about 5 years ago. It was one of the biggest oaks in North Carolina. That building back there is the bull barn where they kept the bulls. And to our left of that bull barn is a 39 Ford liquor car. You might see a liquor case there at the back. And on the rear bumper there, you see a spotlight. That spotlight is for two reasons. One is to unload at night and load. The other is if you're being chased, when you get into a curve with ATU agent behind them, you turn that spotlight on to blind them. And he actually wrecked this guy named William Queen out of Greensboro, ATU agent, back in the 40s. And his son, Billy Queen, worked for me later on, and it's going to be, we hope, the future sheriff of Gifford County. next election. But anyway, that's the purpose of that. Now, what they're doing there, son, don't go anywhere yet now.
He said his arm's getting tired.
What you have there is my daddy's modified, number 2, Gifford Body Company, green and pink. And that car is being held wide open in gear. And the oil that he's putting on that wheel there, he runs back and forth, jumps that chain, is to keep them lubricated because it's going to go up in smoke and then fire if you don't do that. And there's grease on it also. That is a chassis dyno.
Okay.
What he's doing is holding it wide open, and he's moving the distributor back and forth till it reaches the maximum RPM. Those guys in those days tuned by ear. By ear. There was no such thing as a timer like that period of time. Now, when he got his timer set like he wanted, he cut it off. I'd run over to it and reach down on the intake manifold and scrape ice off with my fingers because it's burning methanol and nitro, 25% nitro. Well, they talked a few minutes, and they didn't have to have a fan on it because they would run the methanol and nitro. It actually run cool. You didn't need a fan. And that's why you can get in there and tune it like that with the distributor being right down the very front of that motor. Then next thing they do, they crank it up again, and he'd hold it wide open again and put it in high gear, and they'd be sitting there, that thing just a roaring, and I put my hands on my ears, and he'd be adjusting the carburetors. They had adjustable jets and a Grand Core intake with 2 carburetors. And now the way he'd do that thing, you didn't have the ETG gauges. He didn't know what they were. He didn't know what a dyno was, but he knew that if you loaded that motor just like you're going around a racetrack, that's the time to do it, time to tune it. Well, he looked down at those exhausts, and whatever color the exhaust was, that's what he tried to get them all alike. They'd be red hot about this far. If they go on pasture, it's too rich, or it could be way too lean. And then he knew what he was doing. He'd get them all the same as close as he could, and it may take 30 minutes to do that. Well, then after that, they'd cut it off, and they'd talk about it, and then they'd, put the wheels back on it by that chain horse. I still got that chain horse you see hanging on the back of that tree there.
Yeah.
And that was what you call in 1946 and 47 a chassis dyno. And he didn't know to call it that, but he knew that's what he needed to do to tune that car. I described that to an artist up in West Jefferson. Was it Shoemaker Shoe? But anyway, he drew. He was an artist. He drew all the railroads on buildings and stuff. He was a railroad artist, and he published books for all those trains that he'd painted.
Okay. And
so I told him about it one day. I said, "Could you do that?" He said, "Sure." So I sketched it out, sort of what it ought to look like. He had trouble drawing a 39 Ford. I had to draw a 39 car for him.
Oh, okay.
I failed the 3rd grade in school because of that, drawing 39 Fords and putting them all in my school books and everything. And my mother had to pay for the school books, and I still got them. Got Buck Baker's picture in there, my daddy's, and race cars all drawn in these books, and so I had to pay for them. My mother did.
Smile for the camera, Bryson. You can go down. So smile.
Okay.
There you go.
So that's what the deal is there. And Stephen Shoemaker painted that for me, and we did some prints. I'm going to give you that print so you'll have something to.
That's awesome.
And I got a story with it.
So did you ever try to fly without a plane?
I did.
You want to tell us about it?
I might as well.
You might as well.
Well, here again, get back to the liquor days. Hugh Abercrombie and his family ran the theaters there in High Point. They were a customer of my dad's. And when they had a special, like when the Cowboys come to town, and there's going to be a big crowd there, they call my mother up to come and help, and I'd go with her. Or if somebody was sick, they'd call her, "Will you come and help us?" And I'd go with her, and I sat on the back row. And I get free popcorn. I couldn't wait, and candy and all. And of course, they'd have the cereals, and I'd watch them. And there's one particular time that they had the cereal Batman and Robin flying through Gotham City. And Gotham City, young man, was in New York, and they were flying there with arms out like this, and the capes. They had capes on, and they're just whistling in the wind. And out there was the top of Empire State Building, all that stuff is going right by it. I sit there watching all that, oh my gosh. And so, a week or two later on, my mother bought a new wax tablecloth. And so I asked her, I said, "What are you going to do with that?" "I'm going to throw it away." "Can I have it?" "Yeah." She didn't ask me what I was going to do with it. So I went and got me some kite cord and a pair of her scissors and made me a cape. And I'd run around the yard out there, run around that yard and jump up off the ground. Of course, I couldn't get no lift. Well, being a farmer, looked down there and I set this dairy barn. God, it was a big one. Hayloft way up here. You get 70-some cows in that thing, one lick, you know. I mean, it's a big one. So I went down there and I went up into the hayloft, opened that door. I got back in there about 50 foot, and I come out that hayloft door just wide open. And as I jumped, I had a good head of steam. I put my arms out. And as I started going down very rapidly, I started flapping my arms a little bit faster and faster. And then I don't remember nothing until I woke up.
That's right.
It de-winded me, broke my nose, broke my collarbone.
Jeez.
I couldn't get to the house. I crawled up there later on. I come to. I laid out in front of the yard. Help. She thought I was pulling a prank on her. So finally she came to see what's going on. She saw me laying out there, my face all tore up. She come around there and picked me up. And I'd be about 7 years old, you know, and threw me down on the bed there in the front bedroom, and we got a washcloth to clean my face up a little bit and called Dr. McCain, and he came with a big old Buick, black, with them rings in the fenders, you know, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the three.
So he come there, and I still have my cape on. Yeah. He started laughing. He laughed and laughed. Well, he set my nose and didn't do anything about my collarbone, said he couldn't fix that. So my daddy drove up about that time. He'd been on a run somewhere, and he saw Dr. McCain's car there. He's come in and said, "What's wrong? What happened?" "Your son Billy here tried to fly." So he laughed for about 30 minutes. And so everybody that came for the next 6 months, a year, they had to tell that story to. So everybody in High Point knew that I tried to fly.
Oh, I gotcha.
Did you mention that your dad ran the 53 Oldsmobile?
He ran Oldsmobiles. He didn't know about the Hudson Hornets. The Hudsons would out-handle the Oldsmobiles because of center of gravity. They just sat down on the ground. In fact, you stepped over in one, you sat on the ground just about. But the Oldsmobiles higher off the ground. And they wasn't much into suspension. As I mentioned earlier, that Bud Moore was one of the first to start messing with shock absorbers. I know Rex White did later on in 60, 61 of the Chevrolets, but Bud really started it. My daddy and people like Red Vault did with the old flathead Fords by putting Lincoln Zephyr shocks on their race cars and take the regular Ford shock off and put 50-weight castor oil in it. But what they didn't know is that oil got hot, it would change viscosity. Regular hydraulic oil don't do that, but for 30 laps, see, main events then were 30, 35 laps, then sometimes 50 laps. But you could get by with it if you'd put 50-weight oil in it. But these shocks, you could hardly move them when you put that heavy oil in them. Well, anyway, he got that Oldsmobile. They built 6 Olds in 1953, and he'd won a race in 1952 with Olds. Won a race, it was at Lakewood Speedway, automatic transmission. Olds was trying that S drive out. That was the trailer package to pull. If you camper up the mountains, through the mountains, they had S drive on. If it worked on a racetrack, you go down straightaway, and you get to the corner, pull it down the S drive, it geared it lower, like shifting into third, you know, and leave it in there and go through the corner and get back on it until he got up off the corner and shifted up. Well, they're having trouble with them, and they kept messing with them. My dad was experimenting for them, and he finally won a race for them down at Atlanta in 1952 with automatic transmission. Now, you guys that's read the books will read that Tim Flock said he won the first one in 1955, Key Kafer's car, but that's not so. Actually, that Oldsmobile was the very first one to win with a hydromatic transmission in NASCAR. And Buck Baker was trying to be the first. When Buck passed away, I was at the funeral over there talking to Buddy, and he said, you know, the big number 2 said, y'all beat us to it, winning with a hydromatic transmission. Well, they call them hydromatics, but it had an S drive on it. But anyway, in 53, Olds made 6 special cars for racing. They had the Howard cam in it, had solid lifters, had adjustable rock arms on it. It had different valve covers. You had an option of 2 different carburetors, and one was a Rochester, I believe that was a Carter. And then they made the exhaust pipes for them to run out in front of the tires, and rear tires. And they put them in the trunk. My daddy flew up to Willow Run and got his. Don Perkins, the engineer, come over and picked him up and carried him over, and they filled it full of gas. He drove it home. Stayed there about a week, and then we got in and drove to Daytona Beach. And the deal was, my daddy had lost a race down there before, running out of gas. And if you you know, coming off the beach, the tires back in those days were about yay wide, and you could spin them. And coming off the beach onto the asphalt, you can spin them again. You just light them up. And, of course, you downshift it to help slow it down. But Fonny Flock was a hell of a driver. He come in the corner. He took off, let's see, he won a race or two with Olds in 52, so he got one of those cars. Herschel McGriff got one. And Frank Alford got one, and Olds kept one. And I don't know whatever happened to it, but my daddy got what they call Eskimo white. It had a little bit of green in it. So they took both carburetors and checked the fuel mileage on it, and he put the one that got the most fuel mileage. And then he said that he was going to short shift. And he said, I bet you Fonny runs out of gas, because Fonny likes to show off. I mean, he could back up what he done, what he said. He'd drive him sideways, in and out of a corner. And it didn't make any difference. He was a hell of a race car driver. I think he won about, 25, 6 races, something like that. Well, sure enough, Fonny run out of gas. And my daddy, he started 6th, qualified 6th. He'd pass one about every other lap until he got up behind Fonny. Of course, Fonny was a good bit in front of him. And Fonny run out of gas, about a lap to go. So my daddy cruised by and won the race. That's how he done it. But he predicted that would happen. Then they inspected it and drove the car back home. Wow,
that's cool. That's a great story. I'm sure you told that a few times.
Yeah. I can see it again, but I can see it in color. I mean, I was standing there and watched all that, and I knew what was going on, but I heard them talking about how they're going to do that race, what they plan to do. Another thing I'll tell you right quick, Brother Joe, he's sort of like an Indian. He couldn't drink much. He liked wine. Well, he went up to Mount Airy, North Carolina, where we're going to be in September the 10th, folks. Mount Airy Moonshine and Racers Reunion.
Yes.
Be one of the best shows you'll ever attend. Be a lot of race cars sitting on the street up there. We had 90-some last year sitting on the street up there. And a parade out to the old racetrack, and then all the Moonshiners were there. Big Chuck, Paul Murphy, and different ones. There'll be, I think Mark and Deary's going to try to come this year. And some of the distilleries will be represented up there. But see, we know that Moonshiners helped start racing. Most of the old race car drivers, I can name you a dozen of them right now, that were started out moonshining, hauling liquor. But anyway, Joe went to Mount Airy, and he got to drinking up there a little bit, and he got word. They said, "You're too damn drunk. You can't drive that thing, man. Get out, get away from here." So he went and got a boy named Cowboy Hudson. Cowboy's a big old boy, probably 260, 6 foot or so. Well, they tied him in there with a rope. 39 Ford. Nice 39 Ford.
Yeah.
And away they go in a heat race. And he turned it over in a heat race. And it landed upside down, stopped upside down. And so they run down there to him, and with his big belly, he couldn't find the knot in the rope to get it loose.
Oh.
So Joe whipped out a switch knife and started cutting on him to cut that rope in two so get out of there. And Cowboy said, "Damn it, Joe, stop that. You cutting me to death. You're going to kill me sitting right here." Somebody slapped Joe back out of the way and got the knife and went around where it hooked behind the seat to the floor and cut it. And then Cowboy fell out and hurt his neck when he fell out on his head. It was a fiasco, you know, but wow.
Yes.
You can only learn what you read, and I can show you books that's wrong, flat wrong.
Sure.
But for instance, Tim Flock, first automatic transmission went in 1955. That didn't happen. Well, there's other stories like that too, but I tell you, there's like Soapy Castles. But Soapy knows, and he's going to tell you like I do. That ain't true. This is the way it was. Soapy got his name from Buddy Schumann, Soapbox Derby.
Oh, okay.
I think Buddy sponsored him. And so they nicknamed him Soapy. That's where he got his name from.
But Neil Castles, it was Soapy was.
But he's a great guy too. He worked down at Fish Carburetor. He can tell you a lot about Bob Fish. And Speedy Spears, we just lost him. That's a treasure right there. We lost Speedy Spears here a couple years ago. And Johnny Thompson. There's so many treasures that we have lost in the past few years, and it's just fewer and fewer of us. I hate to say this, but Todd Morris keeps saying you're the last voice. Well, I hate to hear that.
Yeah, I know.
I don't want to be the last voice, you know.
Yeah.
But I didn't see everything, but I saw a lot, and I tried to tell it the way I remembered, the way I saw it. And then would people come to see my father, and they'd talk about it. And then later in years, and later in life, he lived to be 85 years old. I think he passed away in 95, and they would come over there and they'd get him on the radio and talk to him. WM Fartwood, you know, about the early days, who was the best driver. And he gave the Petties a lot of credit, you know, what they did. See, Richard we always said, my daddy and I, that Richard Petty did for racing what Arnold Palmer did for golf, sort of like that. And, of course, our first ambassador of stock car racing, and this is my opinion, would be Fonny Flock. He'd come to the races early, go to the radio stations, talk about it. He'd get on High Point Station there, WMFR, and talk with Frank Smith and my daddy. See, Frank was working for Bill France too, an announcer. And everybody in the family at some point in time sort of helped out, And so he'd go to the newspaper. Bill Curry was the editor, sports editor for the High Point Enterprise. And then for stock car racing in general, I would say Ted Horn was probably the first ambassador. I believe he's the first one to start any type of charity work for, people. But Ted Horn, my daddy, that was his hero. That's the reason he was car number 2, and he had the same style of fonts that Ted Horn used. Because Ted Horn made a big impression upon him when he came to High Point Speedway in 1940. And met, my daddy met him. That's how my daddy ended up meeting some of the other people and getting the quick change rear end and a lot of other stuff he learned from. But just wish I could relive it again. I ask a lot more questions, so I'd be a lot smarter too,
I understand, yeah. So I like to learn from you. Yeah. So maybe someday I can be telling the same stories. Hopefully.
Keeping
That's
history
my plan.
alive.
That's
well,
it.
You can. Yeah. Well, you can. So you started back what year?
Even though I didn't see it in color, I started in racing in the end of 94 season. Okay. But I grew up in Charlotte, and the furthest memory that I have back talking about NASCAR to where I can relate it to a particular date would have been mid-'70s, talking about David Pearson, who was my favorite driver then, arguing with a guy, Bubba Jones, on the school bus because he was a Richard Petty fan. And so I knew Richard Petty was winning all the time, and David Pearson was winning, but he wasn't running quite as much. But anyway. Yeah, that was my favorite.
I remember when David started over at Charlotte, that number 3 car of Rafe Fox. I never knew all that much about Rafe Fox. Of course, he was a Florida guy, But I liked him, and I knew he'd get the cars to run good, and he he made a big contribution to stock car racing, really did. But I know in later years, my daddy would go over to Richard Childress's, and they want to hear the early stories. He'd go over to Billy Hagan's or Turley Bonnie, and one time Sterling Marlin was over there driving for him, and they wanted to tell a story. They loved that old racing. And I heard a lot of stuff, and then you ought to hear my daddy and Lee Petty, and they used to get together and talk about the early days, and my daddy and Jimmy Lou Allen about the early days. And that book Greg Fielding wrote, The First 40 Years of Racing, Greg stayed on the phone with them just about 5 days a week, getting stories about what happened in Canfield, Ohio, or wherever they raced, and they remember a lot of that stuff. But only a few people has ever made an effort to record that stuff. NASCAR never kept much as a record back then.